Hello, everyone. Welcome to Seattle. My name is Brian Meehan, and my colleague Lee Anderson and I are going to be presenting slots in the United States, an introduction to U.S. coordination practices. As I said, my name is Brian Meehan. I am a contracted consultant with FAA for very many years. Looking forward to seeing a number of you that we've met over the many years, and it's been a while for some. So we look forward to a good conference, and turn over to my colleague Lee.
Hi, yeah, I'm Lee Anderson. I know many of you from day-to-day interactions, and I've worked with Brian for a number of years now. Very much looking forward to seeing everyone in Seattle, and I hope you enjoy this presentation about practices of slot controls and schedule facilitation in the United States. So we'll get started. So just a quick disclaimer. So the views in this presentation don't reflect any official position of the FAA or the United States government. They reflect our personal and professional views only. So just keeping that in mind. So the level 2 and level 3 airports in the United States, starting with the basics, of the 500 or so commercially serviceable airports in the U.S., New York JFK is our only slot-controlled airport for the runway and the terminal. DCA and LaGuardia are level 3 equivalents, but have sort of a different system that we won't really get into here because it's mostly domestic airport with some Canadian service as well. And then Newark, San Francisco, LAX, and Chicago's O'Hare are level 2 scheduled facilitated airports for both the FAA runway and the terminals. And then Orlando and Seattle airports are scheduled facilitated for the passenger terminals.
So one of the questions we usually get is, I don't understand the U.S. coordination system. It seems different. And I firmly believe that there are a lot more similarities than differences. We'll go through some of those differences, but in general, what's the same? So U.S. coordination generally follows the WASG to the extent they don't conflict with U.S. laws or regulations. We follow the calendar of coordination activities. U.S. coordination and the FAA utilize many of the coordination priorities, best practices throughout the world, including new entrant preferences, historic rights, continuation of service, et cetera. When FAA set up, in the mid '80s, participating in the slot conferences, spent a lot of time with then the airline folks who were in charge of the conference, spent a lot of time with IATA, and trying to frame some of the FAA's participation and process to fit in as much as possible, given certain legal constraints, including potentially antitrust implications, differences of U.S. government, federal authority versus other authorities. So I think again, much is very familiar. Contact information for the U.S. airports that Lee just covered is included in the IATA list of level 2 and level 3 airports, with the exception of DCA and LaGuardia, which follow many of the principles, but very different rules in terms of seasonality and other issues.
And if you check the IATA contact list, you'll see an interesting thing, which is that there's a contact for both the runway and the terminal at these airports, and that really speaks to one of the biggest differences in the U.S., which is that the runway is controlled by the FAA, which is a federal agency that provides air traffic control services, so the runway slots are allocated separately from the terminal and gate. So at airports in the U.S., level 2 and level 3, carriers will receive two allocations, a runway slot allocation or runway approval, as well as an approval or allocation for the terminal. In many ways, this isn't that different from practices in other countries. The main difference here is that there is actually two allocations rather than having the allocation process happen in the background where a single coordinator will check all of the infrastructure needs. And really this speaks to some of the legal boundaries that the airports are held to, that the FAA is held to, and sort of the different system in the U.S. where you know, a lot of the airport operators are state entities, as well as some terminal entities that are private businesses. So that's one of the biggest differences. It's probably the difference we get the most questions about. Airlines should know that that if you're starting a new service to the U.S., you should receive both a runway and a terminal approval at the U.S. Level 2 and Level 3 airports, other than Orlando and Seattle, which only have the terminal approval. And if there's anything that you take away from this, it's definitely that you should contact both the terminal and the FAA for a runway approval. We don't want anyone to turn up without one or the other.
And Lee, I think you'd agree that the terminals that we work with in the U.S. on the runway side, and with that FAA slot administration, would take a lot of effort to ensure that airlines understand what's a constraint. Is it a runway time? Is it a terminal? Is it some other issue? So that as they look at solutions or potential swaps, they can focus on something that might be workable. I mean, would you agree that that's a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis as well?
Absolutely, yeah. When we work as coordinators on behalf of the FAA, we work closely with the terminal facilitators and coordinators, as well as the airport operators or airport authorities, on ensuring that it's very, very clear to airlines what's the biggest point of constraint. What's the primary issue? How do we work through that? And in some cases, a runway approval will be available and a terminal allocation will not be available. In other cases, a runway approval is absolutely not possible at certain times, but a terminal would be available. In the end, airlines need both, and so we work with the terminal coordinators in tandem with some of the airport operators to try to figure out how to work as many solutions as possible.
There are a few other differences that we would like to cover. So the U.S. allows slots to be used for multiple flight series. For example, a 1900 departure slot at JFK could be used for Rome, could be used for Milan, could be used for any points that the airline chooses to serve, as long as the timing stays within the same slot window. JFK slots, for example, are allocated in half-hour periods from the top of the hour 00 through 29 and 30 to 59. And an airline is free from a runway perspective to schedule any time within those time periods. Again, terminal may have some other constraints, but from a runway perspective, the approval is good for that 30-minute window. As we mentioned, runway slots can also be interchanged between destinations. Flight numbers can change, equipment may change. FAA does not need to approve those for the runway. It's not one of the coordination parameters, again, specifically for the runway. Those factors are really important to certain airport terminals. And if those are communicated to the FAA, we'll respond, in an SMA, SCR message. And again, the terminals probably need that information, so we would encourage airlines to continue to send it even if it's not absolutely necessary for one of the coordinator bodies like FAA. Some of the things that are also different is under the U.S. Law of the 1978 Airline Deregulation Act, the FAA allocation process can't consider markets, equipment, number of services in a particular market. Some of those things that are secondary criteria in the slot guidelines. There are some competition. There is certainly some competition oversight by the U.S. Department of Transportation as well as Department of Justice. Some of those policies are embedded in FAA rules to provide certain priorities for new entrants, like we talked about earlier, and some other issues on neutrality, transparency. So again, I view that as more similar than different, but in particular, looking at markets is something that FAA does not routinely do.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, Brian. And this is actually a difference that provides a good amount of flexibility that a lot of airlines don't know that they have in the U.S. So this is a good piece of information for carriers that in some cases have operated to the U.S. for many years. There is that flexibility to use a slot interchangeably between series, and I think that that's a piece of information that is helpful to airlines to help them come up with as many solutions as possible with the slots that they already have. So one additional difference that's semi-related to the series issue we just spoke about is usage is calculated a little bit differently in the U.S. For level 3 airports. It's calculated on a per slot basis rather than being tied to a series. So because slots are divorced from the series, we're really looking at the 80/20 for a specific slot. Another piece of this is that the FAA does not have a 5-week minimum for a series historic precedence. So basically, a slot is the slot, and the utilization is calculated for that specific slot, and there's no minimum amount of time in which you have to operate that slot in order for it to be considered for historics. One interesting, and Brian, I don't know if you have something to add there, but one interesting thing about U.S. usage in the winter seasons is there is a holiday waiver period in which slots are treated as if used. So the specific dates of the holiday waiver period can be found on the FAA Slot Administration website. And the JFK order, and we'll also provide our contact information at the end of this presentation that we can give you those dates and in which all slots held are counted as if used. And then one additional difference related to usage is so slots returned to the FAA are all considered permanent. So there's no way under the FAA rules to return a slot and automatically retain historic rights. And the FAA did not adopt WASG 8722. So this is an area where if we're talking about differences that provide a little bit more flexibility, like slots not being tied to a specific series or holiday waiver periods, this is an area where it's a little bit more difficult than some practices in other countries, just because the FAA doesn't permit the return of slots where they're just automatically retained as part of a historic base. But the huge caveat here, so that Brian and I don't want to scare you or scare anyone into thinking that your slots are gone automatically or anything. The return slots can always be requested as new on initial submission and are generally reallocated subject to availability. So if it hasn't been reallocated to someone else, it generally is able to be reallocated, subject to availability. There is a degree of risk involved, but we don't want to play up that risk unnecessarily. No one should make any urgent phone calls or panic about this slide.
Yeah, Lee, and I think that many of the returns that FAA gets are similar in concept to what returns occur at some other airports. For example, some of the shoulder periods in a scheduling season, where an airline at a foreign airport, outside the U.S., may return, a few weeks of an operation, or a few days to a few weeks of an operation, and there may or may not be demand at that particular airport. I think we find the same thing in particular at JFK, where we get some of these returns in the beginning or end of a scheduling season, usually for short duration. And in many cases, as the airline asks for those as new, we are able to accommodate it. We do get very, very few peak period returns, during the season. So the practical implication, even though we have this as a difference, is I think it really is closer to a similar practice in the guidelines, with just slightly different application.
Yeah, that's right, Brian. I would say that the biggest difference in practical terms would be returning peak slots and expecting them to automatically be reallocated, which, like you said, doesn't happen very often. And just a quick word about slot performance monitoring in the U.S. So, this is one that is very near and dear to my heart personally, as someone who does a lot of communication with airlines on a daily basis. The U.S. is concerned primarily with schedules and slot approvals and intent. So what the FAA is generally not interested in are the day of operational changes, and this is really should be listed as a fairly big difference from some airports in other countries that are concerned with day of slot clearance. If lavatory number 2 breaks, the FAA does not need to re-clear a slot. We've had airlines call us with engine number 1 started at the end of the runway saying, we just need you to just re-clear this slot, and Brian and I are at home watching TV, and so and that's the point, that we're not a 24/7 operation. We work during federal business hours, Washington DC time, since we're in Seattle, and there isn't a need to request changes like an aircraft change or a ad hoc operational change. We get requests for diversions. It's not necessary, but we will process it. But definitely don't have your OCC alter operations because you haven't heard from the FAA slot office in real time. Another piece of this to give you peace of mind is that the FAA air traffic controllers will manage day-to-day operations without regard for slots. They're there to handle the operation safely and efficiently, and they are not going to handle an operation any differently if it's off slot. And then just a quick note about sanctions. So when the FAA looks for a case of potential sanctions, what they're looking for and what we're looking for as coordinators contracted with them is carriers that are consistently operating off slot with significant variations, who just clearly aren't intending to operate at the time that they're approved, or have been completely unable to for a period of time without, I guess, a good explanation. We're very communicative with airlines. I think that those of you that know us know that we reach out. We enjoy talking to all of you. And so we understand that there are extremely complex issues, especially today with overflight issues, various other issues with, aircraft and, operational issues. I don't need to lecture this group about, all the operational impacts that could be an issue, especially in ultra long haul flights. So we're really looking for patterns.
And then as we're getting ready to wrap up, just kind of want to go over again some of the mechanics of making a request at a US level 2 or level 3 airport, whether FAA or for the FAA runway or for the terminals. Again, the IATA list has contact information for level 2 and level 3 airports. As Lee mentioned, there's a distinction where FAA has runway limitations and the terminal contacts are distinct. So make sure you would submit to both. Here for the FAA slot requests or official FAA slot inquiries, our group email address is on the display here, 7AWA, slotadmin@faa.gov. You're also welcome to contact the slot office, by writing our emails. Brian for me or Lee is on there. In general, the U.S. coordination, FAA and the terminals utilize the IATA SIM format for communications. FAA can be flexible regarding different format types. The preference for most carriers is the IATA SIM, Chapter 6 format, perfectly acceptable for us. But we do have, again, probably a slight difference that predominantly applies to some of the larger U.S. airlines, where we actually use an administrative tracking number or slot ID number rather than the full flight itinerary. An important factor as airlines may be looking to begin service to the U.S. At those airports where the FAA has runway limitations, and in particular at JFK as a level 3 airport, carriers are required to hold valid FAA operation specifications, OPSPECs, and US DOT Economic Authority foreign air carrier permits prior to receiving FAA slot approval. We're welcome to talk to anybody in terms of general availability. We do that very often. Carriers are free to submit an inquiry. They could submit an SMA, SCR, whatever the appropriate format would be. It can be an SAQ, but before a carrier has that DOT and FAA authority, our reply would generally be an SAQ. And again, we're very open to having additional discussions in terms of the general availability in those time periods and what some of the options are. It's usually helpful to have a dialogue on how close it may, the process may be, what you're anticipating on the airline side as we, coordinate with DOT and other FAA offices on the process. So again, kind of a difference, but it seems like we talked a lot of differences in this, and I started off by saying there's a lot of similarities, and again, I think that there really are. A lot of the differences we covered are somewhat administrative, somewhat process, but the end result and the end broad guidelines of FAA rules and the slot guidelines are very similar, except where there are some either distinct policy distinctions or legal requirements or differences in the U.S. Yeah. And just kind of want to follow up if anyone has any questions on on either anything we covered or we missed, or you have some outstanding questions. In addition to our FAA addresses, we've got contact information, for Lee and myself. Feel free to reach out, at any point. We do often kind of get get requests for other airports, and we often have contacts at other U.S. airports that are either not schedule facilitated or slot controlled. So, if we can help you at any point, please let us know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Brian, and thanks to everyone. And we look forward to seeing you in Seattle. And always feel free to reach out. We love talking to you, and we enjoy working with you all. So thank you.
All right, thanks everyone, and thanks again to IATA.